Thanks for joining me today, Tsahi. Let's talk about open source and programmable video platforms. First, let's kind of start with a little high-level definition of the difference from a WebRTC perspective of an open source platform and a CPaaS, a programmable video platform.
Okay, let's start with, I guess, open source. Open source for me is someone that gives you the source code. There are some licensing or, let's say, legal limitations over that code, but they would be somewhat permissive. So you can take that code, do as you like with it, and usually you're getting the whole thing. Okay, let's give an example. The fact that I'm going to give you a nice API that allows you to control my car, and that API is open source, doesn't mean that you get the car for free. So for me, that wouldn't be open source either.
Right.
Because there is like the main piece that I need for that is something that I need to buy from someone. Or let's say I need to buy that from the provider of that code to begin with.
Yeah.
Now, why am I saying that? Because we had in the past a programmable video platform called Twilio, where they built their own open source React application reference on top of their platform, and they said that it's open source. Now, the only caveat there being that you can only use that if you pay for Twilio for running your minutes for their programmable video platform. Okay, so that brings me to the distinction between the two. They're just not the same, apples and oranges.
Right.
A programmable video platform is someone that hosts his own infrastructure of video components, so you can use it as a third party, or you can use it as a customer to build your own application on top of it, whatever that application may be. By the way, he might be using open source to build his own platform. Some or most of these platforms actually do.
Yeah.
And then you get the benefit of not needing to use DevOps and developers that would scale the system, figure out the issues, optimize it, and stuff like that. So you pay for someone to manage the service for you. Now, that someone will usually also give you an SDK and an API. He would give you them in a form that means that they are source code, otherwise you won't be able to connect to him anyways. Is that open source? I don't care, it doesn't matter. Okay, and again, because what you're paying for is the infrastructure, and the SDK or API is only the enabler, that doesn't mean that it's open source, to me at least. It's not how I would use. It's if I would go and say, well, I'm using that, it's open source. No, I'm using that and I'm paying for it.
Right. Well, I like the car analogy that you use, because the only person that's going to give you a free car is family, and we're talking business here, and nothing is truly free. So, with the open source media server, you're still going to have to manage the infrastructure yourself. A lot of times the groups behind an open source platform are going to, offer you some services that's available for a price, of course, to leverage their expertise. And scaling it is, going to be a concern that you need to either do yourself or contract with someone to do. And then the CPaaS, handles a lot of that for you, but they're charging you a premium for it. Usually you're paying more of like a per minute type of charge, something that transactionally is a higher cost than open source would be. But there's a lot of convenience that comes with it, right? So we've got those kind of two options that we've talked about in the WebRTC world for a long time. But there's also some platforms that are, I guess you could say, bridging that gap between them, trying to offer the best of both worlds between an open source and a CPaaS solution. That kind of give you a little bit of both, I guess you could say. So tell us about a couple of those options and how they came to be.
Yeah, so the funny thing is that I saw that very clearly when I worked on my video API report. And you look at the platforms, and there are two that are slightly different from the rest, because they offer kind of two different approaches. You can either come and buy the managed service, the programmable video part that they give you. That would be Jitsi as a service, JAS, or LiveKit, the cloud variant of it. Okay, but then what they come and say is, look, the platform itself, the video infrastructure that we give you, is built out of this open source platform that we ourselves create and maintain. For Jitsi as a service, that's the Jitsi Media Video Bridge with all of the components around that. And then for LiveKit, it's LiveKit. Now, the benefit can be said to be, well, you know what? You can start with our managed service. If it becomes too expensive and you want to start investing on your own, just host your own stuff with the open source parts of that, because the open source is readily available. Or you can do the opposite. You can start with open source, see that it's too much of a headache, and then move and use our platform. There's also a third part of, well, use our open source, but then for certain components, use our programmable video solution for these things. Like, we'll do the recording for you, or we do the telephony part bridging for you, because it's too much of a hassle. That's, for example, what Jitsi as a service offers, the ability to get certain components and use them for their platforms as well.
Yeah, I like the this possibility that it offers of being able to transition between the two. Either direction, as you said. I tend to think of it most often the first scenario you described, where when you're first building your product for the first time, you want to get to market as quickly as possible. So you go with a CPaaS type of solution because you can, less infrastructure to manage. Presumably you can get the application done sooner. But then as you start to scale, you start to become more concerned about the transactional costs of that. And so sometimes that's when companies look at either negotiating with the CPaaS provider, which is usually an option when you reach volume, so they don't have to make changes, or they look at implementing additional media servers or switching platforms or going to an entirely open source solution that they manage themselves, because by that point, presumably they're technically mature enough that they can, handle all the DevOps around that, right? So if you're using something like LiveKit or Jitsi as a service and having that option to make that transition in either direction without as many code changes, that's pretty attractive. And I think, and certainly something that sets them apart from other platforms. Yeah. So something interesting to look at.
I would say that that's true until you remind yourself of two things. The first one, when you're big enough, the risk of switching even to the same platform and just something that you manage is huge, because you have too many users that that are on the line there.
Yeah.
So the risks are still there. They're different though. It's not about development, it's about users. And the second thing is the fact that they say that they're open source doesn't mean that all the components that you use from these platforms are open source.
True.
So for example, GT does a very good job at providing almost everything. I mean, including how to scale the GT services and cascade them across the globe and stuff like that, all the scripts around that. I'm not sure if LiveKit does the same. Or do they just give, here is an SFU, now you can build what we built on our own.
Yeah. Well, the risk of any change as you scale is large, of course, as you said. And then the other risk I would point out too is like, I'll call it, I guess, an integration risk, in the sense that, like, when you use LiveKit as a paid product, they've got, live streaming integrations, conversational AI, a lot of options that you start to build in that, with any service, as you use more of their custom paid wrappers around other important things to the flow of your application, that's going to make it harder to switch to an open source from that to a simpler architecture.
Every programmable video platform would try to lock you in, to provide, to put some vendor lock-in in place, which means that switching to something else is going to cost you.
Yeah.
How much? More than you'd like to pay. Hence, you're going to stay with them for another year until you're going to go over the same decision-making process again with the same result, usually.
Right.
Okay. Now, would the ones that offer open source not do the same thing? Sure, they would. But they now have a nice story and excuse of, well, we also do open source, hence you can move back and forth, which is correct to some extent, but I would say not with the customers that they want to keep, which are the large ones.
Right, right. And then the other option, I've heard seen in some cases, I think is interesting to consider architecturally, is depending on how the pricing tiers for your product works. If you have a freemium tier with fewer functionality, perhaps that's built using open source infrastructure where you can more, have more direct control over what the transactional costs are of that, or not offer more expensive things like recording, for example. and then only use the CPaaS and the fancier integrations, let's say, to your paid tiers. So using a slightly different architecture in both is another way to go to try and balance these costs.
Well, I heard today of another one with a client, which was very, very interesting. They're using two CPaaS platforms, two programmable video platforms. They use one, but when that one doesn't work because the return servers are being blocked by that specific firewall of that specific customer, they would fall back to the other one, which presumably works at that scenarios, which is interesting.
Yeah, we've seen that as well. Excuse me, more complicated to implement, but a definite possibility. So I want to ask you one last question, Tsahi, about this before we wrap up. So when you think about the number of providers that have, they either specifically offer an open source and a paid solution like LiveKit and 8x8 and Jazz do, and then others like Twilio in the past built on top of Corrento and other providers who have used open source in their architecture somewhere, what does that tell you about kind of the view of the industry? Is it easy enough to build a media server, if that's the right way to say this, that they don't mind sort of giving that away for free? Is the value all in the scaling around it? I mean, I know a lot of people who built media servers. I don't think they would say it's easy, but these companies are kind of willing to focus the pricing on, let's say, the scaling part of it.
I think the answer is complicated. Okay. The first part, it's not easy to write a media server. Otherwise, we'd have more than 4 alternatives out in the market. We probably have more, but you have 4 dominant ones, and all the rest are just, you ignore them.
Right.
Okay. And writing one is really hard. Optimizing it for specific use cases is even harder. Now, most of the vendors that provide programmable video solutions would use an open source platform, an open source media server. They won't if they were there earlier. So the earlier the vendor, the more likely is to use a proprietary media server solution. If I were to open a programmable video company today, not going to do that, but if I would go and use one of the open source platforms, hands down. That's what I'm going to do.
Yep.
Also, if you look at the history of these platforms, so Jitsi as a service started by Jitsi media server, by BlueJean, a company that offered, development services. And they happened to have this open source platform. They did their customization work for customers on top. They got acquired and eventually ended up at 8x8. And then the business model in 8x8 couldn't have been, let's do customization and support work. It doesn't work in such a company. It's not enough money. So they switched and say, we're going to do programmable video, which makes sense for them. But they kept the open source platform. Twilio acquired Corrento, killed it, and then moved on. So there was no open source left out of that from Twilio.
Yeah.
LiveKit is built on top of Pion. Pion is open source. They don't have control over that, even if they do contribute to it. And then they built a LiveKit solution on top of that. So they went through the open source phase, tried to figure out what their commercial, play is there, and ended up with something that is open source and programmable video. Why? I don't really know the reasons behind that. It makes sense because it seems as if they are succeeding in the market, at least by the companies that they are able to attract.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, unfortunately, we're running over time here, but this has been a good conversation. We can probably continue it at another time. Thank you, as always, for sharing your insights with us today, Tsahi. You mentioned your video API report as well. That does, I'm sure, go into more of this in detail. I'm sure that's available at bloggeek.me, correct?
Yep.
Excellent. So go there to learn more about Tsahi's work and to learn more about future episodes of WebRTC Live. Check us out at webrtc.ventures. Thanks for joining me today, Tsahi.
Sure. Thank you.